Hi, good afternoon, good evening, or whatever out in cyberspace. I wanted to thank everyone for inviting me to do this presentation, and I hope it'll be useful to you and get you thinking in some new ways about magic and about some of the ways that we work, especially in rituals. So, what I want to talk about today is the law of identification. Now, these laws of magic I'm using are from the book Real Magic by Bonowitz. And what he did was codify certain ways in which things work. The old anthropologists really only had two rules that they had for looking at the magical processes that they saw that they were investigating, particularly in pre-literate tribes and that sort of thing. They talked about sympathy and contagion. Sympathy is something like another thing, which Bonowitz calls the law of association, and contagion is has it been in contact with something else. So if you're focusing on a picture or something of someone that has the sympathy connection, if the picture has touched the person or if they have some of their sweat on it or whatever, that's contagion. And if you're doing a healing ritual focusing on that picture, then those connections make it stronger. But one of the things that identification is, it's certainly part of the law of association, what the anthropologists called sympathy. And we're used to those kinds of things representing one thing or another. Everything from, a stop sign representing the word stop and the action of stop is an association. And indeed, our brains work by association. So, what is identification, though? The thing is, the law of identification, how a person becomes someone or something else, it shows up in magic and in religion and in psychology and everyday life. Even a teenager simply playing air guitar is identification. They're trying to become or admire something. Um, you know, uh, it's funny, but air guitar has actually gotten to the point of world competitions. There's an annual competition every year in Finland for the best air guitar player. I haven't seen it yet. I'm hoping to visit Finland again and maybe be able to hit up that wonderful tradition that the Finns have started to establish now. But what about the religious and magical uses? Okay, let's talk about that for a little bit. Those of you that have a Catholic background, maybe you had a good Sunday school teacher and they actually gave you a magical ritual that uses identification. Now, a lot of times, especially Christian education, doesn't emphasize these kinds of things, but there is a tradition called the Stations of the Cross. And it's a recreation of the times when Jesus was carrying his cross and everything up to be crucified. And there are various things that happened along the way, according to scripture. The Stations of the Cross is actually a meditation where you become and think about what each of those things symbolizes on the way. Yeah, so if you want to be more Christ-like or whatever, go for it and remember that particular incident. There's also a book called The Imitation of Christ and this sort of thing. This is not unusual in the Christian and Catholic traditions. But let's look at a few other things that are even more law of identification. In the African traditions, especially those that have come with the African diaspora to America, such as the Voodoo traditions, you actually have possession by particular kinds of spirits. In a voodoo ceremony, one of the things that happens is you get possessed if you're a high enough practitioner, or if you're, I guess, in a sense, lucky enough. You are taken over by the particular spirit of a kind of In Africa, they're called orishas. In Voodoo, they're called loas. And people actually exhibit the particular behaviors connected to that spirit. They will smoke a pipe or ask for certain kinds of things like a brandy or whatever. And the followers know and use those signs as ways to understand what's happening in the ritual. And they have a long tradition of being able to manage people in those states of consciousness. In older traditions, in shamanic kinds of traditions that you may have read about in anthropology books, people are possessed by the spirit of a bear, the bear spirit or the mouse spirit or whatever. Brought into the Western ceremonial tradition, we have the god forms that the Golden Dawn used. You get all these people in a fancy ritual place, and some of these temples can look quite beautiful. I was in one temple in Chicago with the black and white tiles and the whole thing, and the stations set up very nicely. And part of what happens in those rituals is people are channeling or becoming those particular kinds of God forms to bring that kind of spiritual essence into the ritual. So these things exist all over the place. But where did they come from? Why did something like this, so elaborate, start to become part of ritual that is almost universal? Well, think about it, folks. When you were a little kid, didn't you play firemen or cowboys and Indians or Luke Skywalker? All of those things, children playing, trying to be adults, warriors, or being their own parents, you're learning future competencies, different ways of being that you can then get into your nervous system in order to accomplish those things, or at least be familiar with them. So when you think about little kids playing, it's not useless. It is future growth. It is analysis. It is what the nervous system, what humans do in order to become ready for their roles in certain things. Now, in more modern psychology, we look at people who in adolescence take on their heroes, okay? Or think about people who want to be like other people, like celebrities and that sort of thing. You get, for instance, some people who have done entire careers in the movies or in various art forms, and they're inspired by someone else. What would it be like to be Picasso or to be John Belushi performing on Second City stages or with Saturday Night Live or any number of different comedians? Those types of things, people take on those identities. And indeed, when actors are acting, that is one of the main ways that they get into their characters and become this other person. There's an entire school of acting, in fact, where you try and drop your own identity and become the other person. And some people actually stay as that other person throughout the entire time that they're doing whatever kind of movie they're working on. Dustin Hoffman, in fact, is extremely famous for taking on these roles and becoming the other person for a period of time because they're learning, they're living, they're breathing, they're taking that entire thing on. In competition, in sports, people will think about their idols and how someone did something or other. In fact, when kids are playing and all the rest, they are being, whoever their sports idol is. And they're thinking about that. It motivates you, it gets you moving, and it gives you an identity to fall into where you start to pick up the particular behaviors and, importantly, the values that then start to drive your particular behavior. In modern psychology, there's all sorts of ways of looking at what are the possible selves you can have for your own personal growth, okay? When you are going through things like trying to plan out your career, or you're just starting to go into something like university studies, you will maybe unconsciously think of the possible selves you can be with all the different majors that you can have. Maybe you were inspired by somebody that you saw, or you saw a movie about a physicist or a doctor or somebody like that. That's one way of rehearsing and becoming that particular person or that self as just a framework for you to grow into. Now, in everyday life examples, look at people who are sports fans. Okay, this is one of my favorites because if you're a sports fan, one of the things that can happen with you is you're going to a game, and say the team wins, you jump up and down and all the rest, and you start saying, "We won, we won." You weren't on the field. Okay, you weren't down there hitting the ball or tackling someone or whatever. In all logic, you don't take any credit for that. All right. But what happens? You're identifying with the greater whole, the greater team, the greater experience that's in the stadium. And certainly many people can understand that and get the feeling of it, especially the energy of a huge crowd. And that's one of the things that people go to these events for, to get that sensation of we won. Okay. You're identifying with the team, with everybody in the crowd, etc., and getting off on that particular kind of high. All right. Yes, air guitar is another way that people sort of get into things, and they prepare themselves for then going to that great concert or whatever and being able to see whoever it is that they are really admiring. Okay. In other kinds of things, what's become really popular now, and there's enough YouTube videos and all the rest, look at cosplay. Okay. People coming up with wonderful costumes and all the rest, looking and changing their personality and their types and taking on these different characters and having a fun time with it. They're just not doing enough magic with it. Okay. And we'll get to that in a second. But there is a real psychology to all of this, and it allows you to take some time and be able to do things so that you can practice all these different personalities, these different states of the mind and body. All right. Now, what about the magical applications of this? All right. In classical Wiccan ceremonies, you usually have two people officiating. Okay. You have the priest and the priestess. And in the tradition that I came from, the priest actually identifies first with typically a male deity. And they are the ones then that ask you to, that then ask the priestess to take on her identity. So what happens when I was doing that? Well, here's something that you may want to consider. One of the things that you can do is to take something from my training in neurolinguistic programming, which officially is called a pseudoscience, but as magicians, we don't care about that, do we? Think about who you want to become. Let's say we are doing a Mars and Venus kind of ceremony, or better yet, okay, Hephaestus and Venus, okay? Hephaestus, otherwise known as Vulcan, was actually the husband of Aphrodite Venus, okay? And what wound up happening was there's a whole cycle of mythology around this and her relationship with Mars and all the rest of that. And yeah, they had a little affair and everything. But one of the things that happens is if you're trying to pull in the essence of Aphrodite, why not become Hephaestus? And what you can do is learn a little bit about him. Well, he was strong because he was doing the forge and all the rest. So imagine yourself having tremendous upper body strength. Okay. Imagine your muscles rippling. your chest being strong, your forearms being huge, okay? Because you're swinging the hammer and the anvil all the time, doing all the work for the gods of creating all these different beautiful things for them, okay? He was the god of the forge, but he was also the lame god. He also had a bad leg, all right? Now, when I took on Hephaestus, I remembered all of that. And I imagined all of that happening. And did I become really huge? No. I saw Hephaestus maybe above me and seeing that whole sense of, wait, that the very beginnings of technology, the very beginnings of strength and being clever and all the rest is some figure above me. And he shrinks down and he becomes me. But I also get smaller because I have a leg that's bad. So I shift myself a little bit. I lean on one leg more than another. And I think about, what does that mean to not have all my capacities? And there's tremendous things that we can learn also about disability and the idea of a still competent but disabled God, but that's a whole other matter, okay? So what happens? He's there. I become him for a short period of time. And what do? I call forth in the priestess my lover, my wife, Aphrodite. And I think, what does she mean to me? That I have these attributes, I have this cleverness, I have the rest of this, but she is the goddess of love. And I talk to her about that. I talk to her about her beauty and all the rest, helping the priestess to bring forth those attributes, okay? And then we do the rest of our standard opening, okay, which oftentimes is kissing or some other kinds of thing to show that connection between the deities, okay? And then we use the power of those deities that we have invoked in the rest of the ritual. Maybe we're doing a divination. Maybe we're doing a healing process. Could be any number of other things, or somebody is asking of some kind of wisdom. Oh, yes, one thing that I did remember too, before I knew that I was going to do this Hephaestus working, I memorized a poem by Longfellow called The Village Blacksmith. A really good way of getting in touch with that kind of energy, that kind of groundedness, that kind of power, and his connection to his family and all the rest. Little bits and pieces so that you can get that idea a little bit better. Now, what about working with this in other ways? Okay. What would you do if you were, say, someone wanting to do a love spell and bring Aphrodite into your life? Okay. Well, you could be Hephaestus, but yeah, a little bit shaky because Aphrodite sort of played around a little bit, and she played around with Mars. So in that ritual, you may want to instead become Mars, okay? Because you are then becoming that essence of maleness, that essence of strength and all the rest. And you're trying to draw a female energy to you if you're doing, like a general love spell calling thing. If you are going to be doing something, for instance, to prepare for your studies, okay, you would bring in Thoth, the Egyptian god of learning magic, or you would become Hermes, okay? Especially the version that existed in ancient Egypt of Hermes Trismegistus, who brought out the Hermetic teachings. You would figure out some of the connections and all the rest and do your kind of work from that kind of situation, okay? From those kinds of things that you had learned and worked with. So you can see that there's a lot of different things that are possible with all of this, okay? And you can continue to work these kinds of things in your own life. Now, if you're trying to bring in a particular kind of energy, let's say you're working with Hermes, spend a little bit of time, not even just in ritual, But say right before you take the test, imagine pulling in Hermes' power. Okay. Imagine knowing everything and allowing it to flow out of you. This way, you step out of yourself, you step out of your normal, limited self, and find that you're working in an archetypal way and working in a way in which you can connect to those kinds of energies. Because what you're doing here is not just being the limited self of your limited beliefs. Okay, you're connecting to the greater reality that is out there and hooking into maybe the Akashic records, or maybe, if you're being really scientific, just finding a new way to access that internal information that you have without the worries and the troubles, okay, of you being nervous on the exam or whatever it is that you're trying to do. Yeah, all of that time in playing air guitar, all of that time of being a kid playing fireman and all the rest, all of that is part of what you prepared for using this kind of magic. Okay. If you're going to go into the boss to ask for a raise, who would you want to ask the raise for you? Would it be John Wayne, James Bond, maybe someone who was extremely powerful female figure like Maya Angelou? Okay. Think of those people that you admire and take on some of those attributes for a few minutes. Okay. And from that position, take that energy in. You don't have to put on John Wayne's accent. Okay. But you can take on a little bit of that kind of energy to be able to perform that kind of task that you want to get done. So, what we've seen about this is the magical law of identification isn't just connected to occult textbooks, all right? It's proven and woven into the way that Buddhists visualize deities. They become Green Tara, for instance, and feel the absolute compassion for all of humanity and all of existence. And they use the mantra to connect up. It's the way that Catholics walk with Christ through the stations of the cross, and the way that kids pretend to be their parents or firefighters, and the adults will fake it till they make it in their careers. Yeah, that is identification also. Okay. From the monastery to the playground to the workplace, the same principle is working. You're identifying with something larger and it changes who we are. So here's the thing. What I'd like you to think about is what kinds of people, who or what are you identifying with today? Whether it's some sort of Christian saint, could be, maybe a story, a role model, Gandalf, Harry Potter, okay? Or maybe Merlin, or maybe you just have a dream of who you want to become. The act of identification is shaping your future self. And that's a power that we all share, whether you call it magic or not. So think about all of that. Hang out with who you want to be. Hang out with the powers that you want to have. And use the magical law of identification in your continued work. Become that god or goddess and find out more about yourself and break out of yourself and be who you really want to be. Thank you much. And thank you everyone for having me on the show today. And go forth and take some of this and work with it, whether it's in your individual work or working with your coven, your temple, whatever organization that you're in, or maybe just working in office politics. Have a great day and blessed be everyone.